Written in Bone, Buried Lives of Jamestown and Colonial Maryland by Sally M. Walker. Chapter 4, The Captain. The teenage boy, whom may have been Richard Mutton, is one among many fascinating life stories that archaeologists and forensic anthropologists have rescued from the buried past of the colonial Chesapeake area. A different grave, found in Jamestown a few years before JR 1225B, posed a set of puzzles and possible solutions, no less compelling. The discovery began with a trash pit that William Kelso's team of archaeologists unearthed in 2002 as they excavated alongside what had been the western wall of James Fort. Within the pit, settlers had buried typical 17th century colonial trash, pieces of tobacco pipes, bricks, and oyster shells. Because these artifacts dated approximately to the 1630s, the team knew that anything beneath the trash pit would have to belong to an earlier time period. To their surprise, what they found as they continued to dig was the telltale soil stain of a grave shaft. Most graves and graveyards are treated with respect. People wouldn't customarily bury trash above a grave unless the presence of the grave had been forgotten. Two other interesting facts stood out. Unlike other graves found during the excavation of the fort, this grave was outside the fort, not within it. And because the grave lay parallel to the fort's wall, the team knew that the wall must have already been standing at the time the shaft was dug. As Kelso's team excavated the grave shaft, they screened the backfill soil that had been used to fill it centuries before. They found no colonial artifacts in the soil. In the earliest graves, we find nothing but prehistoric materials, Kelso explained. Historians and archaeologists use the term prehistoric to refer to the time before written history. The lack of colonial artifacts in the backfill didn't mean that the grave was dug before the colonists came to Jamestown, though. Because it lay parallel to the fort wall, it must have been dug after the fort was built. As Kelso described, the contents of the backfill simply meant that the grave is from a period where there isn't enough historic material around to accidentally end up in the shaft. Together with the materials in the trash pit and the presence of the fort wall, the backfill helped the team date the grave to 1607 to 1608. The shape of the burial itself indicated that the remains had been enclosed in a coffin, a rare privilege for Chesapeake colonists early in the 17th century. Because building a coffin required time, energy, and wood that could all be used in other ways, most individuals were buried in shrouds only. The use of a coffin suggested that this grave contained the remains of a person of some importance. When the archaeologists excavated down to the level where the coffin lid would have been, they made another unusual discovery. A rust-color soil stain was outside the coffin. The stain, which was near the end of the coffin that contained. Now, the caption in the picture on page 44. Archaeologist Tanya Dietz Rock carefully brushes away the soil from the skull of remains buried outside the James Fort walls. In the caption in the picture on page 45, a long staff, right, was buried with the remains. The iron tip was heavily encrusted with rust. The colored pole next to the staff is a measuring tool. Now on page 46. The upper part of the body narrowed suddenly and continued for about 5.5 feet. We didn't really know what it was, Kelso recalled. The rust in the soil suggested the presence of an object made of iron, and indeed, close examination suggested that there appeared to be some sort of artifact encased in the rust. The artifact was very fragile, and so it was excavated as a block, with the surrounding soil still firmly around it. The block was taken to a laboratory to be x-rayed to attempt to identify the artifact's shape before the soil was removed. The x-ray revealed an object that the archaeologist had seen in drawings from the 17th century, the iron pike, or point, of a captain's leading staff, a lance-like weapon used by persons of high rank in the military. The pike fit on a long wooden pole called a shaft. In the grave, the long, thin soil stain that extended away from the rust-encrusted iron pike was the only remaining evidence of the staff's wooden shaft. While the leading staff could have been used in combat, it's also possible that it was carried as a ceremonial weapon. A weapon like this one would have been placed in the grave only as a sign of respect and honor for a revered person. Kelso recalled, for example, that some other courtiers who served with Queen Elizabeth I of England had placed their own leading staffs in her grave as a sign of respect. As the archaeologists continued their work, they were delighted to discover that the skeleton in the grave was very well preserved. The remains were given the official identification number of JR1046B, but the leading staff prompted the team to dub the skeleton the Captain. Other than a few missing foot bones, the skeleton was complete. As Kelso described it, on a scale of 1 to 10, the Captain is a 10. Given the poorly preserved state of other Jamestown skeletons, such as JR1225B, where the captain's bones in such excellent condition. After all, the captain's bones, like the others in Jamestown, had undergone a destructive alternating cycle of wet and dry conditions. His wooden coffin would have quickly deteriorated, offering no long-term protection for the bones. The answer, as in so many archaeological puzzles, is the soil. The area where the captain was buried has sandy soil with a very different consistency than the clay-filled soil that surrounded the graves of JR1225B and other colonists buried within James Fort. Water easily drains from sand, so the soil didn't remain wet for long even after heavy rains. Because the captain's bones hadn't laid in swampy underground puddles as the others had, they were better preserved. This preservation helped the team readily glean useful information from the bones. For example, while JR1225B's graves and remains had required considerable analysis to determine how he was buried, Kelso immediately felt certain that the captain was definitely shrouded. Not only were his knees and leg bones positioned close together, but the bones from his right forearm had green stains, an unmistakable sign of decomposing shroud pins. Shroud pins, or straight pins, like those used in sewing clothes, were used to hold together parts of a shroud. Most evidence of such pins is found around the skull. The picture and caption on page 46. Before removing the staff, it was x-rayed. That's the top picture. The conservators cleaned it to reveal its shape, and that's below. The caption and picture on page 47. Shroud pins are used to hold a burial shroud in place. When they are made of copper, the pins leave behind a green stain above after they've corroded. Page 48. That's because when a body was shrouded, the face was only left exposed so that family members and friends could see the individual's face as they paid their last respects. Shortly before a burial, a separate piece of cloth was placed over the face and pinned in place. Well-preserved shroud pins may look almost as good as new, but such preservation of colonial shroud pins, which were usually made of copper, is rare. When buried in soil over a period of centuries, copper undergoes chemical reactions to cause it to corrode or decay. Corroded copper forms a substance called copper oxide, which leaves a green discolorization. Poorly preserved copper pins may only remain as a small green fleck or a stain on a bone or in the soil. Doug Owsley's forensic examination of the captain revealed more. The pelvic bones helped confirm the skeleton belonged to a male. Bony spurs called lipping had formed on the male's spine and right arm. Lipping is a sign of arthritis, a painful disease that often affects the joints of older people. The lipping on the captain's bones were minimal, suggesting that he had just a touch of arthritis. That plus the fused feces, I don't remember how to say that, on his long bones indicated that he was between 33 and 39 years old when he died. Features on the skull suggested that he had a large, broad nose and a small, square chin. Based on the length of his leg bones, he had been about 5 feet 3 inches tall. The overall size of his bones indicated he had been slender rather than a stocky man. Thanks to another principle of forensic anthropology, Ousley was able to assess the captain's level of physical activity during his lifetime. No matter how active people are, the bones appear slightly thicker in the places where muscles attach to them. When a person uses the same muscles frequently over time, however, the labor is reflected by further changes in the bones. One way a body responds to a muscle being heavily used is by building more bone mass in the area, Ousley explained. The areas where heavily used muscles are attached to the bone become even more developed and defined as a result.